"You are the maid," my sister laughed into the microphone, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "You belong in the kitchen." My mother smirked from the head table. My father raised his champagne glass. The wedding guests burst out laughing, a wave of sharp, overlapping sound that filled the Bellwether Hotel ballroom. I stood perfectly still. The silver serving tray dug a cold edge into my bare palms. The heavy scent of roasted duck and expensive white lilies hung in the air, thick enough to choke on. I was 39 years old, the operations director for White Laurel Hospitality, but tonight I wore the black uniform and white gloves of the catering staff, because my sister demanded it. Across the room, Rosa stood frozen by the kitchen doors. Young Tasha kept her eyes on the floor, her shoulders tense. I said nothing. I just held the tray and let the laughter wash over me. Then the groom stepped forward. Owen took the microphone right out of Paige's hand. He did not smile. He walked down the carpeted steps, stopped directly in front of me, and held out the mic. "Tell them the truth," Owen said. The room fell dead silent. I set the heavy silver tray on a nearby empty table. Grabbing the fingertips of my left glove, I pulled it off and dropped it next to the champagne glasses. 4 months earlier, the truth was just something I kept in a spreadsheet. My alarm went off at 5 in the morning in my Providence apartment. The old radiator clanked, a familiar, steady rhythm while I poured my black coffee. I sat at my small kitchen table, moving my night school planner aside to open my laptop. My 6-month emergency fund sat safely in my savings account. I had built a quiet, orderly life, far from the chaos of my family. Then my phone buzzed against the wood. A text message from Rosa. The direct deposits did not clear. My stomach tightened, but I did not grab my keys and rush to my parents' house to fix it. Instead, I opened the company payroll dashboard. I checked the logs and matched the numbers. The money was simply missing. My finger hovered over the transfer button for my personal savings account. I had covered the shortfall twice before, quietly patching the holes Paige left behind. I pulled my hand away from the mouse. I closed the browser tab. I would not buy my sister another month of pretending. Paige walked into the White Laurel office 3 hours later. Carrying a massive arrangement of white orchids, she dropped the flowers right onto my desk, scattering water droplets across my keyboard. "The bank is processing things slowly today," Paige said, waving a hand in the air. I pointed at my monitor. I matched the clock and reports against the payroll batch. 30 hours vanished from the system. Paige sighed loudly, rolling her eyes. "Just fix it like always, Leah." I leaned back in my chair. "I will correct the data, but I will not advance my own money to cover the gap this time." My sister stopped moving. Her eyes widened, and the practiced, elegant smile dropped completely off her face. "What are you talking about?" "It is just a minor cash flow glitch. Then the company can secure a bridge loan," I said. She stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language, turned on her heel, and marched into her private office. That night at my parents' house, the dining room smelled like pot roast and tension. Paige spent the first 20 minutes of dinner bragging about how White Laurel was expanding its luxury portfolio, detailing the custom linens she had ordered for the upcoming season. My mother passed the bowl of roasted potatoes, her gold bracelets clinking together. "Leah, you are always the strong one. Your sister just needs a little help right now with the boring administrative details." "We are family," my father added, cutting a piece of meat. "We do not need to keep score with paperwork." I kept my voice completely flat, refusing to match their emotional pitch. "Any financial support or loan from me requires a signed agreement and a repayment schedule." Paige let out a sharp, mocking laugh. She looked at our parents. "Since when does the person who makes the schedule act like the chief financial officer?" My father chuckled. My mother offered Paige another glass of wine. They sat there, drinking from crystal glasses, completely comfortable using my competence as their joint checking account. The next morning in the staff break room, the air felt heavy and smelled like burnt coffee. Tasha twisted a cheap paper napkin in her hands until it tore. "My rent is due on Tuesday," Tasha whispered, looking down at her shoes. Rosa crossed her arms over her uniform apron. "This is the 3rd time hours just vanished from the system." I looked at the 12 people gathered in the small, cramped room. They were looking to me for a miracle I was no longer willing to buy. Take pictures of your pay stubs, I told them. Save your schedules. Write down your hours in a notebook you keep at home. Document everything. Tasha looked up, her voice shaking. Are we getting paid? I negotiated an early payment from a client account, I said, keeping my tone steady. It gives us enough operating funds to run an emergency payroll today. But that is a patch, not a fix. Rosa stepped closer to me. What happens when she does it again? Then I stop fixing the same problem, I said. And we build something that does not need her. I stayed late that evening. The office was completely empty. The only sound, the low hum of the air conditioner. I opened the operating report. Because of my role as operations director, I had legal access to the general ledger. I scrolled down the screen, stopping on the exact date the payroll had been delayed. A massive transfer had gone out to Maribel Events. 2 hours later, another massive deposit cleared for a luxury wedding florist in Newport. I documented the date, the approval signature, the missing payroll amount, and the related vendor invoices. Using the compliance tools available to me as operations director, I exported a read-only copy into the company's restricted audit archive. I printed the access log, noted the archive location, and locked the screen. I did not remove client information or send company records to a personal account. I preserved only the financial documents I was authorized to review. I did not call my sister to argue. I did not drive to my parents' house to demand an apology. Instead, I picked up my phone and booked a legal consultation with a business attorney named Dana Cole. Paige had not run out of money. She had chosen who deserved to be paid. A dusty cardboard box sat in the center of my living room rug. I pulled open the heavy flaps, breathing in the smell of old paper and stale air. Digging past tax returns and lease agreements, my fingers found a faded yellow folder. Inside lay a letter of withdrawal from the local community college dated 12 years ago. Beneath it sat a tuition receipt for an expensive hospitality management program, stamped paid, with my sister Paige listed as the student. A photograph slipped out from between the pages. In the picture, I was 27 years old, wearing a stiff housekeeping uniform and standing next to a supply cart. My chest felt tight, but I did not cry. Back then, quitting school and working 2 jobs to keep my parents out of debt and put Paige through college felt like a family duty. Looking at the paperwork now, under the harsh glow of my living room lamp, the reality shifted into sharp focus. A sacrifice made at 27 did not create a permanent debt at 39. I put the papers back in the box and closed the lid. The next evening, fluorescent lights hummed loudly in a small classroom at the community college. I sat in the second row of my small business operations night class, my notebook open. The instructor tapped a whiteboard marker against his palm. He spoke about internal controls and the separation of duties. A healthy business never allowed the same person to approve expenses and process the payroll, he explained, because that structure invited fraud. My pen stopped moving. Paige authorized every vendor payment for White Laurel, and she had full administrative access to alter the payroll batches. We had no separation of duties. We just had my sister. I wrote one sentence in my notebook. A system that depends on one good person is not a good system. Closing the book, I realized I could not call my mother for advice on this. Instead, I checked the confirmation for my consultation with Dana Cole the following afternoon. For the first time, I was not asking my family how to solve a family problem. I was asking a professional how to protect the people my family had harmed. The following morning at the White Laurel office, I decided to test the waters. I compiled a full payroll reconciliation report and attached it to an email. In the message, I formally requested that we hire an independent payroll processor to prevent future discrepancies. Paige replied 10 minutes later. Her tone was incredibly sweet, thanking me for the suggestion while entirely avoiding any mention of the missing funds. Then, 30 minutes after that, another message dropped into my inbox. My blood ran cold. The email was a direct order from Paige. Hold the second payroll batch until Monday. Maribel Events has to be paid before the wedding. Leah can handle staff complaints like she always does. She had written it down. The exact thing I had spent years doing, reduced to a casual command. I did not reply. I saved the original email, captured the metadata, and moved the entire file into a secure preservation folder. That afternoon, I sat in a leather chair across from attorney Dana Cole. Her office smelled like lemon polish and old books. Dana folded her hands on her desk and looked at me clearly. She stated that our meeting was strictly a consultation regarding lawful evidence preservation, and she was not representing me in any personal lawsuit against my sister. I nodded, sliding my printed folder across the wood. After reviewing the timeline, Dana leaned back. Do you want to save the company, save your sister, or protect the workers? All three, I said automatically. You cannot, Dana replied, her voice gentle but firm. Those goals are no longer compatible. You have to choose. The silence in the room felt incredibly heavy. I thought about Tasha worrying over her rent and Rosa documenting vanished hours. I need to protect the workers, I told her. Dana nodded. She instructed me to only save documents I had authorized access to through my role as operations director. No client lists, no hidden recorders. Keep everything strictly professional. Then she mentioned a different business model. The workers could organize and form a cooperative. But they have to vote on that themselves, Dana warned. If they form an entity, their board will need to hire their own legal counsel. You cannot do it for them, and I cannot represent both you personally and their cooperative. That evening, the local diner smelled of fried food and bleach. I sat in a booth with Rosa across from me, a mug of black tea warming her hands. I explained the documentation rules Dana had given me. Save the schedules, keep the pay stubs, and document every hour worked outside the software system. I made it absolutely clear that I could not promise to save the current company. Rosa stirred her tea slowly. We follow you, Leah, not your sister. I shook my head. Do not follow me blindly. Everyone has to choose for themselves. We need a system where people are seen and paid on time, regardless of who is in charge. We agreed to organize a private information session at the public library for the rest of the staff. Stepping out of the diner into the cool night air, I felt the terrifying weight of a new responsibility, but I was not turning back. Late that night, my phone screen glowed in the dark of my apartment. An email notification popped up from my mother. Beverly had accidentally forwarded an entire conversation chain while asking me to update the wedding vendor list. I scrolled down past the floral arrangements and catering menus. Near the bottom of the chain, a message from Paige caught my eye. Once Owen signs the line of credit, we can hire a real operations director to replace Leah. Below it, my father had replied, once Owen signs, we can cover the shortfall. Until then, keep Leah calm. My mother's response followed a minute later. Just keep her from doing anything before the wedding. I sat very still, reading the words a second time. My mother and sister were plotting to discard me the moment their financial rescue was secure. I printed the email chain and added it to my evidence timeline. Then I logged into my personal bank portal. I found the recurring utility payment I had been making for my parents' house for 5 years, and I clicked cancel. Opening a new tab, I checked whether the name Common Table Services Cooperative was still available in the state registry. I downloaded the public formation guide, reserved a library meeting room, and saved the filing instructions without submitting anything. No entity would exist unless the workers chose it for themselves. They were not planning a future with me in it. They were planning how to use me until they no longer needed me. The fluorescent lights in the public library meeting room buzzed a low, constant note that vibrated in my teeth. 10 folding chairs formed a messy circle around a scratched plastic table, smelling faintly of floor wax and damp winter coats. I sat wedged between Rosa and Tasha, keeping my hands folded tightly in my lap. Dana Cole stood near the white presentation board, maintaining her professional distance. The attorney explained the legal options clearly and deliberately, stating that she did not represent anyone in this room until a formal entity existed and hired her. We could stay at White Laurel, resign individually, or form a worker cooperative. A housekeeper named Elena raised a hesitant hand and asked if I would own the new company. No, I answered, looking directly at her. I would have exactly 1 share and 1 vote, just like every other person in this room. Rosa leaned forward in her metal chair, her voice steady and demanding attention. The veteran supervisor told the group they needed a system where the people doing the heavy lifting were seen and paid on time. Heads nodded around the circle. We agreed to take a week to read the paperwork, and no one cast a vote that night. The following Tuesday, at the White Laurel office, the tension finally snapped. Paige marched into the scheduling area, gripping a clipboard so hard her knuckles turned white. My sister had just cut Tasha from the lucrative weekend banquet shift, simply because the young woman had asked for a printed pay stub. I opened the master scheduling software and immediately restored Tasha to the roster. My fingers hammered the keyboard as I typed the justification note, citing the exact employment contract terms. Paige leaned over my desk, her expensive floral perfume clashing sharply with the smell of printer ink. She accused the staff of getting dangerous ideas from me. Expecting accurate wages is not a rebellion, I told my sister, keeping my eyes fixed on the monitor. Her jaw tightened until a muscle twitched in her cheek. Paige demanded my administrative password, claiming she needed to monitor the system for security purposes. I do not share personal credentials, I said. I opened a new email to the technology department and copied Paige. I requested that they create a separate administrator account in her name, with all access changes and system activity preserved in the audit logs. Paige watched me send it, her mouth tightening. Whatever she did next would carry her own username and timestamp. Exactly 7 days after our first meeting, the library room felt entirely different. 12 workers sat up straight, holding printed paper ballots. The vote to form Common Table Services Cooperative passed unanimously. The new board immediately elected Rosa as the temporary chair. I accepted the role of planning coordinator, holding only my single share. Rosa recorded every decision in the official board minutes, preserving the timeline of our collective choice. Then, the newly formed board voted to formally retain Dana Cole as their legal counsel. Rosa signed the engagement letter that cemented Dana as the cooperative attorney. I provided my documentation simply as a worker owner, without any special legal privileges. We funded our initial reserve account through small membership contributions and a legally secured credit union loan, completely avoiding my personal savings. Thursday morning, I printed a formal letter of resignation. The document stated my intent to step down as operations director after a standard transition period. I emailed a digital copy to Paige, and 30 minutes passed with no response. My father almost happened to be sitting in the conference room reading a newspaper. I walked in and he read the single page, his shoulders slumping under his tailored suit jacket. The man who raised me looked up, practically begging me not to do anything rash before the upcoming wedding. I am fulfilling the terms of my employment contract, I said gently, but I will not cover another shortage. That evening, I sat on my living room sofa, watching the rain hit the glass window. My phone vibrated against the cushion. A text message appeared from a junior coordinator at the office. The message stated that Thomas had carried my signed notice directly into Paige's private office. 10 minutes later, my father had asked the technology department to begin restricting my server access. A second message followed, containing a blurry photograph of a computer screen. The glowing image showed a draft of an internal memo Paige was writing, and my name sat right next to a paragraph about the missing payroll funds. I typed a text to my father, asking why he gave her the confidential document. His reply arrived a minute later. He claimed Paige needed time to prepare, begging me again to keep things quiet until after the wedding. My own father had chosen his side to protect the family image. My chest felt hollow, but my hands remained completely steady. I saved the photograph, archived the text messages, and emailed Dana to tell her the system lockout was imminent. When I arrived at White Laurel the next morning, my computer monitor displayed a red error message. My login credentials no longer worked. Rosa walked up to my desk and quietly placed a printed sheet of paper next to my dead keyboard. It was the finalized internal company memo, bearing my sister's signature. I read the document twice. Paige had announced to the entire company that I had altered the payroll records without authorization, caused the financial shortfall, and resigned abruptly upon being discovered. My sister had even taken a single sentence from my previous email about fixing data and quoted it completely out of context to simulate a guilt-ridden confession. I did not shout, and I did not storm into her office to demand an explanation. Picking up my cell phone, I called Dana to confirm our digital backups were secure. By morning, my name was on a document I had never written, beside a confession I had never made. The leather chair in Dana Cole's office felt remarkably cold as I slid a heavy manila folder across the polished mahogany desk. The thick packet contained my authorized system exports, copies of pay stubs the staff had voluntarily provided, and my legally preserved email correspondence. Dana tapped her silver pen against the files, deliberately reminding me that she sat in this room as the legal counsel for Common Table Services Cooperative. She did not represent me in any personal capacity. I nodded, fully understanding the legal boundary. Next to her, Mina, an independent accountant the board had hired, flipped through the pages. The quiet professional compared my audit logs against the fabricated memo Paige had circulated that morning. The timestamps completely destroyed my sister's narrative. Dana immediately drafted a formal preservation letter on behalf of the cooperative, demanding White Laurel maintain all original server data. Watching the printer spit out the legal demand, a sudden realization hit me. Paige locking me out of the system was not merely a temper tantrum. My sister had severed my access so she could falsely claim I continued altering data after submitting my resignation. Later that afternoon, the atmosphere inside the White Laurel conference room felt toxic enough to peel the paint. 12 employees walked in and placed their formal resignation notices on the glass table, legally leaving the company payroll according to standard procedure. Paige stood at the head of the room, her face flushed dark red, loudly accusing everyone of betrayal. Rosa stepped forward, her voice calm and completely unbothered. The veteran supervisor explained that no one was abandoning the clients, but the team absolutely refused to continue working inside a system that failed to issue accurate paychecks. Panic flickered behind my sister's eyes as she quickly did the math. It was completely impossible to hire and train 12 reliable hospitality workers right before the massive summer event season. We transitioned immediately into business negotiations. Dana presented a 90-day service agreement, stipulating that White Laurel would officially purchase event staffing from Common Table. The contract clearly detailed the payment schedule, strictly prohibited any interference with cooperative members, and established severe penalties for late payments. I did not hold the pen. Rosa, acting as the elected chair of the board, signed the document. Paige scribbled her own name on the signature line and tossed the pen aside with a sharp laugh. She announced that as soon as her wedding finished, she would find some real staff. 6 weeks passed, and the ink on that contract barely had time to dry before White Laurel missed the deadline for our very first invoice. The cooperative board held a brief morning meeting, immediately authorizing Dana to send a notice of service suspension. Paige showed up at our temporary workspace, looking absolutely frantic, practically begging us to keep the team in place through her upcoming wedding weekend. Dana stood firm and placed 2 separate documents on the table. The first was a formal acknowledgement of White Laurel's debt. The second was titled, Personal Guarantee in large, bold letters. Dana explained that by signing the second document, Paige would become personally responsible if White Laurel failed to pay. She advised Paige to have independent counsel review it before signing. Paige barely glanced at the pages. Owen's line of credit will clear everything after the wedding, she said. Then she signed both documents in front of Rosa, Mina, and a notary. The desperate bride operated under the absolute certainty that her wealthy fiancé would inject massive amounts of cash into the business right after the ceremony. Looking at the wet ink on that guarantee, I memorized the exact moment my sister voluntarily tied her own personal assets to our unpaid labor. The following Tuesday, the bell above a local coffee shop door chimed. Owen slid into the booth across from me, handing me a plain black coffee. The groom looked exhausted, leaning forward to ask me directly why White Laurel had suddenly shifted to a contractor model so close to the wedding. I took a slow sip, carefully choosing my words, explaining that I simply could not discuss confidential personnel matters. However, I strongly advised him to read every single page of any financial document before he attached his name to it. Owen frowned, mentioning that Paige wanted him to sign a substantial commercial line of credit immediately following the reception. I set my mug down. Do not sign anything that says there is no debt, I told him, refusing to cross the line into sabotage while still offering a genuine warning. The next afternoon, I sat in Dana's office reviewing the upcoming banquet schedules when an email notification popped up on my phone. Owen had voluntarily forwarded a single scanned page of the commercial loan application Paige wanted him to sign, simply asking me to verify a specific detail. The official bank document explicitly stated that Leah Dawson bore total responsibility for all recent payroll discrepancies. Not even an hour later, my phone buzzed with a text message from Paige, complaining about the floral arrangements. In that casual message, my sister reminded me that I was never real management, just the person who handled the staff. I showed both screens to Dana. The attorney adjusted her glasses, noting that those two distinct versions of reality could not possibly exist at the same time. I printed the email and the text message, sliding them into my expanding manila folder. I chose not to confront my family just yet, knowing the cooperative needed a solid foundation before the inevitable explosion happened. Paige was carefully building a trap, constructing two completely contradictory stories. In one document, I was only the maid. In another, I was the woman Paige planned to blame. The Bellwether Hotel ballroom smelled strongly of ocean salt and expensive floor wax 2 weeks before the wedding. Paige leaned over a massive seating chart spread across a velvet chair, her diamond engagement ring catching the overhead light. As the representative for Common Table, I stood nearby reviewing the service logistics. My sister tapped a manicured fingernail against the diagram. "You should probably stay near the kitchen during the reception," she told me, suggesting it was the only place I would actually be useful. Owen walked past carrying a box of programs, pausing long enough to mention he had already placed my name card at the main family table. Paige forced a tight smile until her fiancé walked out of earshot. Then the bride leaned close to the wedding planner, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper, requesting a backup staff badge printed with my name. Standing just a few feet away, I heard every single word and chose to say absolutely nothing. The next morning, my computer screen illuminated the quiet corner of my apartment. Mina, the independent accountant for the cooperative, had flagged a new series of credit card statements during the final document transfer. Flipping through the digital pages, a sick feeling twisted in my stomach. The company operating account showed massive charges for a luxury bridal suite, premium floral upgrades, and expensive velvet chair rentals. Every single receipt bore Beverly Dawson's signature, categorized neatly under Client Appreciation. I saved the files into my preservation folder, suddenly remembering my mother standing in our childhood kitchen, lecturing me that loyal employees always waited for their paychecks because family came first. That afternoon, gray clouds gathered over the hotel parking lot following the final menu tasting. The damp asphalt smelled like approaching rain. My father intercepted me before I could reach my car, his tailored suit jacket blowing slightly in the wind. Thomas looked around nervously before asking me to please avoid embarrassing Paige in front of Owen. I asked him why he handed my official resignation notice directly to my sister, keeping my voice completely level. Thomas rubbed the back of his neck, claiming he only wanted to buy some time. Then the man who raised me let a massive truth slip, admitting that once Owen signed the final paperwork after the ceremony, the newly injected funds would cover all the missing payroll. A cold realization washed over me. My father knew about the financial shortfall all along, and he actively relied on this marriage to erase the debt. The family brunch on Sunday morning tasted like cheap champagne and heavy hollandaise sauce. Paige sat across from me at the corner table, swirling her mimosa. She loudly announced to Owen that I simply did not understand weddings because I always chose spreadsheets over building an actual life. Beverly smirked from the head of the table, offering no defense for her eldest daughter. I set my fork down, refusing to defend my single status. Instead, I looked directly at my sister and asked if she had finished reading the terms on the commercial line of credit. Paige dropped her glass. The crystal hit the table with a sharp clink, and her face went completely pale. She stammered out that business had absolutely nothing to do with me anymore. Sitting quietly next to her, Owen narrowed his eyes, clearly logging the massive contradiction. Back at the Common Table office on Tuesday, Rosa dropped the final banquet event order onto my desk. The veteran supervisor pointed a trembling finger at the contingency section. A specific note sat right in the middle of the page. Leah Dawson to serve as backup. If she refuses assignment, document refusal, and remove from property. There was absolutely no operational reason to single me out. Rosa demanded we pull the entire staff immediately. I shook my head, reminding her that our people had already accepted partial payment and desperately needed the income. We would honor the contract, document everything, and walk out the loading dock doors together at exactly midnight. The night before the ceremony, the hotel hallway echoed with the sounds of the rehearsal dinner wrapping up downstairs. Owen stepped out of an alcove, stopping me near the elevators. The groom looked incredibly tired. He asked me point blank if Paige was using him to save the hospitality business. "The evidence does not belong to me alone," I told him, measuring every single word. "But I will promise you this. If Paige lies about me or the workers in front of you tomorrow, I will stop protecting her." Owen stared at me for a long moment. He nodded slowly, promising that if my sister told another lie, he would personally hand me the microphone. I walked back to my room and sat at the small desk, drafting a 3-minute statement composed entirely of verifiable facts. She had not invited me to her wedding. She had staged me inside it. Rosa handed me a pair of stark white cotton gloves, her expression tight and unreadable. We stood in the service corridor of the Bellwether Hotel just hours before the ceremony, surrounded by the heavy scent of roasted duck and expensive floral arrangements. I had arrived wearing a formal guest dress, but checking the operational handoff remained my primary responsibility. The service contract between White Laurel and Common Table expired exactly at midnight. Our team had verified every invoice, logged every hour, and confirmed the board decision. I pulled out my phone, typing a quick preservation message to Dana, noting that every schedule change today had to be officially documented. Rosa smoothed her apron, reminding me that Paige had specifically chosen these gloves so the catering staff would look invisible and elegant. I folded the white cotton into my pocket, keeping my breathing completely steady. Down the hall, a heavy metal tray hit the carpet with a muffled thud. Tasha stood rubbing her wrist, her face twisted in pain. Paige marched out of the bridal suite, dragging the heavy hem of her silk robe across the floor. The bride did not ask if the young server was injured, simply threatening to dock the entire team tip pool if the champagne reception started short-staffed. My sister knew exactly how much these workers relied on that money. Stepping between them, I cited the safety clause in the new cooperative contract, stating clearly that Tasha could not perform dangerous lifting. Paige crossed her arms, a cruel smile forming on her lips. To protect the team income and fulfill the paid portion of our agreement, I made a tactical choice. I grabbed a spare black uniform jacket from the supply rack, pulled it on over my dress, and slipped my hands into the white gloves. I texted Dana immediately, noting the assignment change by Paige and preserving the witnesses in the room. I would carry the tray for one single round. Carrying the silver platter back toward the kitchen a few minutes later, a hand caught the swinging wooden door. Owen stood in the narrow hallway, connecting the bridal suite to the service corridor, wearing a tailored tuxedo. He held a thick packet of financial documents, blocking my path. The groom tilted the top page toward me, pointing at a specific legal representation clause. The printed words stated that White Laurel held 0 outstanding labor or contractor debt. Owen looked exhausted, explaining that Paige had just dismissed the recent cash shortage as a temporary confusion created entirely by me. I did not hand him any secret files or break my confidentiality agreement. I simply reminded him that a signed debt acknowledgement existed, advising him not to sign anything he could not personally verify. A door slammed open behind us. Paige rushed into the corridor, saw us looking at the paperwork, and snatched the packet right out of his hands. Her sudden movement caused the top page to tear, leaving a photocopy fluttering to the floor. Owen stepped on the paper, securing it beneath his leather shoe. The champagne reception felt like walking through a suffocating cloud of expensive perfume. Beverly spotted me carrying the heavy tray through the crowd. My mother did not ask why her eldest daughter was serving drinks, simply reaching out to adjust the collar of my black uniform jacket as if I were a hired stranger, before turning back to her conversation. A few feet away, Thomas raised his crystal glass. My father loudly joked to a group of investors that his oldest daughter always knew her place. Scattered laughter rippled through the wealthy guests, most assuming this was some bizarre family humor. I looked across the room and found Rosa. The veteran supervisor stood by the kitchen doors holding a clipboard, actively logging the hours. I kept my face completely blank. The string quartet stopped playing. Paige tapped a silver spoon against her champagne flute, demanding the attention of the entire room. Sensing Owen standing too quietly beside her, the bride needed to reclaim the spotlight. Searching the crowd, her eyes locked onto my uniform. Paige called me toward the head table, presenting me to the guests as a shining example of how everyone had a specific role in life. "You are the maid," my sister laughed into the microphone, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "You belong in the kitchen." Beverly smirked from her velvet chair. Thomas raised his glass higher. The bridesmaids giggled first, a sound that quickly escalated into a wave of sharp, overlapping laughter filling the ballroom. I stood perfectly still, letting the humiliation wash over the crowd before setting the heavy silver tray onto an empty table, making sure the edges lined up perfectly straight. Owen did not laugh. The groom stared at Paige, his jaw tight. He asked his bride, loudly enough for the front row to hear, if I was truly just a maid without any financial authority. Paige doubled down, repeating to the crowd that I had never managed the company. Owen looked down at the torn photocopy he had folded into his pocket. He stepped away from his bride, walked down the carpeted steps, and stopped directly in front of me. He held out the microphone. "Tell them the truth," Owen said. The room fell dead silent. Reaching for the fingertips of my left hand, I pulled the white cotton glove off and dropped it onto the silk tablecloth. I had spent 12 years protecting my family from the truth. Then I lifted the microphone and decided they could survive it without me. I looked out at the sea of tuxedo jackets and silk gowns. The silence in the ballroom felt heavy, pressing against my skin like an incoming storm. Clearing my throat, I told the crowd that I had spent years scrubbing floors, cleaning hotel suites, and serving people who never once bothered to learn my name. I affirmed that I felt absolutely no shame in that labor. What I did feel shame for, however, was the reality of where the money went when it was diverted away from the people who actually performed the work. I did not launch into a long, tearful history of my past sacrifices. I stayed strictly focused on the facts. I informed the room that White Laurel Hospitality currently owed thousands of dollars in unpaid wages and contract fees to the Common Table Services Cooperative. I explained that the service contract legally expired at midnight, and the board of the cooperative had voted to terminate the relationship days before the wedding. I had sent multiple formal warnings and a resignation notice a full month in advance. Every relevant payroll document already resided with our attorney and accountant. I emphasized, loud and clear, that I held no power to unilaterally drag the entire staff away from their posts. I only possessed the power to stop holding the company up when it chose to collapse. Paige stood a few feet away, her face twisting into a mask of pure fury. She grabbed the other microphone from the floor, screaming that I was a pathological liar who had never managed a single cent of the company finances. Owen stood right beside her, holding the loan application I had seen earlier that afternoon. He looked down at the paper, then directly at his bride, and asked Paige to explain why she had explicitly written that I bore total responsibility for all recent payroll discrepancies on this official bank form. He questioned which lie she was asking him to marry, the one where I was merely the maid, or the one where I controlled every number in the organization. Paige stuttered, stammering that I had somehow forced her to write those details. But the groom simply walked away from her. Beverly stood up from the head table, her voice shaking with rage as she called me ungrateful for destroying such a beautiful day. Thomas joined in, lecturing me about how family matters should never be aired in front of strangers. I looked at my father and told him that the family made the matter public the exact moment they laughed at me. A few guests lowered their champagne flutes, looking uncomfortable. A handful of the kitchen staff began standing a little straighter, their eyes finally meeting mine. I did not ask for an apology, because I knew I would never receive one. Owen turned toward the altar, announced that he refused to sign any fraudulent loan documents, and promptly returned the engagement ring to Paige. He explained to the stunned room that he refused to marry anyone who used his name to conceal debt and shift blame. Paige let out a high, thin wail, shouting that I had taken everything from her. I looked at my sister, voice steady, and told her that I had only stopped holding everything up. The reception atmosphere shattered instantly. I walked back toward the service corridor, keeping my stride measured and professional. Rosa, Tasha, and the rest of the common table members waited by the loading dock. They completed every remaining task we had already been paid to perform, accounted for the inventory, and clocked out together. Rosa formally recorded the exact time of our exit, verifying the contract reached its legal expiration. We walked out of the loading bay in silence, leaving the expensive equipment and the catering mess behind for the hotel management to handle. Paige screamed from the ballroom entrance that I was poaching her employees, but we kept walking straight toward the parking lot. The next morning, the sun rose over a different reality. I walked into the temporary office we had leased for the cooperative, feeling a strange, hollow sort of relief. A man wearing a dark jacket stood by the glass door, waiting. He identified himself as a process server and handed me a copy of the complaint because Paige had named me individually. Rosa received a separate set in her capacity as Common Table's board chair and registered representative. The filing included an urgent application for a temporary restraining order against the cooperative. The document painted me as the mastermind behind the entire operation, but the legal demands specifically targeted the operational assets and the bank accounts of the cooperative. Paige had lost her wedding, so she was trying to take our paychecks with her. Dana Cole sat across from me in our small, cluttered workspace, her expression neutral as she read through the legal papers Paige had served. As the counsel for Common Table, Dana explained that the complaint alleged theft of trade secrets, tortious interference, and poaching, specifically naming me as the primary architect of the entire maneuver. I kept my breathing slow and even, focusing on the numbers on my laptop screen. Our cooperative reserve fund remained intact, more than enough to cover the payroll scheduled for the coming Friday. Rosa and the board members gathered around the table, taking a formal vote to continue operations with our new client roster, all of which had signed contracts only after the White Laurel agreements officially expired. I felt a surge of genuine pride watching them take ownership of their own professional future. Mina joined us at the table, spreading out the audit logs we had carefully cross-referenced. She confirmed that every single payroll delay coincided perfectly with the dates wedding vendors received their large deposits. I watched as Mina highlighted the suspicious patterns, showing how business credit cards belonging to Beverly had paid for luxury suite rentals and custom chair upgrades while our staff waited for their wages. The final piece of the puzzle came from the email chain Beverly had accidentally forwarded to me months earlier. Mina opened the preserved copy and verified its original headers and timestamps. Near the bottom was a message Thomas had sent to Paige and Beverly. Once Owen signs, we can cover the shortfall. Until then, keep Leah calm. Because Beverly had forwarded the full chain directly to me, we could establish exactly how the document had entered our evidence file. Seeing the words written by the man who raised me felt like a physical blow to my chest. But I set my jaw and pushed the pain aside. I did not need his approval to do what was right. Within 48 hours, Paige escalated the conflict by posting a tearful video online, claiming I sabotaged the wedding because I was jealous of her happiness and determined to steal her business. The internet can be a cruel place, but it also demands accountability. A guest who had attended the reception uploaded a raw, unedited clip of the entire speech, including the moment Paige mocked my role as a maid and denied my professional authority. Public sympathy shifted in our direction almost instantly, as the narrative my sister crafted crumbled under the weight of her own recorded words. I followed Dana's strict advice, refusing to engage with the social media drama, leaving all official statements to the cooperative legal counsel. Owen walked into Dana's office on a rainy Wednesday afternoon, looking like a man waking up from a long, confusing nightmare. He did not ask for a favor or look for a way to reconcile with my family. Instead, the former groom pulled a stack of documents from his leather briefcase, including the original loan application Paige had begged him to sign. The paperwork contained the same false representation that White Laurel held zero outstanding labor debt. Owen looked at me with deep regret, asking for nothing in return, and I thanked him for his integrity without offering any false hope of a future relationship. He left the room, permanently removing himself from the cycle of my family's deception. A few days later, we sat in a quiet hearing room while a judge reviewed the initial request for the restraining order. Paige and her legal team presented a version of events that portrayed Common Table as a criminal enterprise. Dana stood up and presented our organized timeline, proving the board decision occurred before the wedding and that the contracts had expired by the time the staff transitioned. The judge denied the request to freeze our accounts or halt our operations, ruling that the cooperative maintained the right to conduct business. The legal battle would continue through discovery, but for the first time in over a decade, I felt like the architect of my own fate, rather than a victim of someone else's design. As we walked out of the courthouse, Dana pulled one final document from her binder. It was the original personal guarantee Paige had signed during our desperate renegotiation, along with a separate document Thomas had signed to secure the older credit line. The implications hung in the air, heavy and unavoidable. Paige and my father had gambled everything on the assumption that a marriage to Owen would erase their financial mistakes. They had signed away their personal safety to maintain a lifestyle built on our unpaid labor. I stood on the courthouse steps, watching the afternoon traffic crawl past the gray stone building. My hands stopped shaking. I understood that the consequences they faced were not the result of my revenge, but the inevitable harvest of the seeds they had planted themselves. The cycle of covering for their errors, lying to keep the peace, and sacrificing my own security to protect their image had reached its final destination. This no longer ended with the company. Paige had signed a personal guarantee for the cooperative debt. My father had separately guaranteed White Laurel's older credit line. Each of them had placed a different signature beneath a different promise, and both promises had now come due. The next 6 weeks felt like a blurred montage of long hours and determined progress. I watched from the office window as the common table staff transformed our small, modest space into a humming engine of productivity. We kept our heads down, fulfilling new contracts and building a reputation defined by reliability, while the news coming out of White Laurel painted a much bleaker picture. The boutique company stood nearly empty of its experienced workforce, struggling to process complaints and losing most of its major renewals. The few clients who remained demanded discounts White Laurel could no longer afford. Vendors sent demand letters that went unanswered, and rumors reached us that Paige had begun selling off her designer car, her collection of bags, and even the expensive accessories from a wedding that never took place. Through it all, I kept attending my business management classes, refusing to check in on the wreckage I had left behind. My life was finally my own, no longer tethered to the moods or the debts of the people I had spent my youth trying to save. The settlement conference took place in a sterile, windowless room filled with the smell of stale coffee. Paige sat across from me, her posture stiff, still insisting to anyone who would listen that I was the mastermind who manipulated the entire company into collapse. Dana sat beside me, her expression professional and composed, refusing to get drawn into the emotional mudslinging. When it came time to speak, Dana did not raise her voice or engage with the accusations. She simply presented the timeline, carefully mapping out the sequence of events. She laid out the formal warnings I had sent months in advance and showed the board meeting minutes proving that the employees had organized the cooperative on their own accord. Paige tried to interrupt, but the facts remained stubborn and unyielding. The accusation that I had poached the staff fell apart completely once the judge reviewed the contract dates, showing the White Laurel agreements had already expired. Then came the financial breakdown. Mina, our accountant, stepped up to the table to walk through the records she had meticulously prepared. She laid out the bank statements, payroll changes, and vendor invoices that all perfectly aligned by the date. The evidence screamed the truth louder than any of us could. When Paige tried to point the finger at Beverly, claiming the older woman had used the company card without permission, my mother let out a shrill gasp. Beverly immediately turned on her daughter, shouting that she only used the card because Paige had told her it was marketing expense. Witnessing the loyalty they had demanded from me for years dissolve into petty finger-pointing felt like watching a long, agonizing collapse. The mask of the united family had finally disintegrated under the heat of the truth. The legal evidence chain tightened around their throats. Dana highlighted the signed debt acknowledgement Paige had provided to Common Table, confirming her personal liability. Then, she pulled out the lender documents showing my father had signed a separate guarantee for the credit line that Paige had claimed was debt-free. Beverly had to account for every cent of personal charges she had funneled through the company. Thomas's personal guarantee exposed his private assets if the debt remained unpaid, including the vacation condo he had spent years protecting. The loan application that listed me as the responsible party for the payroll shortfall sat on the table like a bomb, proving Paige had planned to use my reputation as a shield, while simultaneously denying my authority to act in any professional capacity. After hours of exhausting negotiation, we finally moved into separate rooms to hammer out the final terms. The proposal was clear and balanced. White Laurel would pay Common Table's unpaid invoices, contract penalties, and legal costs. Paige would remain personally liable under the guarantee she had signed. The employees' earlier unpaid wage claims remained a separate matter. Each affected worker had filed an individual wage complaint with the assistance of Independent Labor Counsel, and the settlement required White Laurel to fund those payments in full. Beverly would return the funds for her personal charges, and Thomas would have to handle the financial consequences of his guarantee. In exchange, Common Table agreed to dismiss its counterclaim for unpaid invoices and contract penalties once every required payment cleared. The individual workers retained control over their separate wage claims. Both sides also agreed to a narrowly written non-disparagement provision that did not prevent anyone from providing truthful information to a court, regulator, lender, or tax authority. Common Table did not ask for the shirt off their backs, and we certainly did not demand their primary residence, but I refused to let the vacation condo become a bargaining chip. If they wanted to keep their assets, they would have to find a way to settle their debts without expecting me to pay the price. As we gathered our belongings to depart, the air in the hallway felt heavy and stifling. Paige, Beverly, and Thomas stood in a tight huddle near the elevator, their faces pale and drawn. My father stepped into my path, his eyes searching my face for a flicker of the old daughter who would always make things right. He told me that if I simply agreed to reduce the claim and used my influence to convince Rosa to drop the contract penalties, he could keep his vacation condo. Beverly followed up by whispering that true forgiveness was something a good older sister was supposed to offer without conditions. Paige leaned in, her voice cold and desperate, promising to go public and declare that I was innocent of all wrongdoing if I just helped her stabilize the situation one last time. I stood there, listening to the familiar, desperate rhythm of their manipulation. They were trying to package my surrender as an act of grace. I looked at the pen sitting on the table, the small plastic tool that could finalize our freedom. Rosa looked at me, her eyes steady, waiting for my cue. I did not owe them my silence, and I certainly did not owe them my future. I leaned toward Dana and took the pen from her hand. Every movement felt deliberate and heavy as I signed the settlement, ensuring that the agreement was strictly bound by the Cooperative Board resolution and the legal demands we had established months ago. I was not signing a family deal. I was enforcing a professional contract. All I had to do was sign away part of what they owed, and they would call my surrender forgiveness. The heavy legal document lay on the conference table, its ink still fresh and binding. I pushed the pages toward the family members waiting for my compliance, my fingers feeling strangely light. They watched me, expecting the usual capitulation, the softening of my resolve that had defined our dynamic for a dozen years. I told them no, keeping my voice low and devoid of the old, weary desperation. I would not reduce the claim to save the vacation condo. I signed the settlement exactly as the Cooperative Board had authorized, ensuring the contract debt, legal costs, and wage arrears remained fully covered. They looked at the paper with wide, disbelieving eyes, as if the reality of their situation had only just begun to sink in. I told them the loss of their assets did not come from me. It was the direct result of their own signatures and the choices they had made while I was too busy protecting them to notice. Thomas called me cold, his face reddening, but for the first time in my life, I felt the weight of that label fall away. My father was finally feeling the consequences he had spent decades shifting onto my shoulders. The aftermath of that signature moved with the slow, grinding inevitability of a glacier. Paige had lost the wedding, and now she watched as White Laurel underwent a total liquidation process. The domain name, the high-end office furniture, and every piece of remaining inventory went onto the auction block to satisfy the creditors. She sold her designer car, her collection of leather bags, and even the expensive accessories from a wedding that would never happen. I did not follow the news to gloat, though I knew the details through the mandatory settlement reports Mina forwarded to our board. My sister was eventually forced to take a position as an administrative coordinator at a local supply warehouse, a job that came with a standard salary and zero managerial authority. She was paying back the debt in small, agonizing monthly installments, her lifestyle permanently adjusted to match her actual income rather than the one she had fabricated for so long. My parents experienced their own quiet, steady unraveling. Beverly had to provide a full accounting and return the funds for every personal charge she had funneled through the business. a process that stripped her of the social status she had carefully curated through philanthropic boards and local committees. I stopped paying their utility bills, ceased organizing their holiday celebrations, and no longer acted as the buffer between their demands and the rest of the world. Thomas sold the vacation condo, the final sacrifice to handle the guarantee he had signed, and the loss clearly weighed on him more than he would ever admit. Paige moved back into their primary house, turning the quiet suburban life they had enjoyed into a crowded, argumentative space where they were forced to deal with her daily frustrations firsthand. I kept the lines of communication open to the extent that I answered written inquiries, but I never responded to their requests for money. The distance felt like breathing fresh air after years spent underwater. Common Table finally occupied our new, modest operating space 4 months after the wedding. The office was small, smelling faintly of citrus cleaner and fresh paper, but the walls were clean and the filing cabinets were organized with absolute precision. Our board held a formal meeting where they voted, with total transparency, to hire me as the operations director with a set salary and a standard professional review process. I accepted the title, knowing it came with clearly defined responsibilities, rather than a vague, unending burden of family servitude. Tasha walked into my office on a Tuesday afternoon carrying a small square frame. Inside, protected by glass, sat the white cotton gloves from the night of the wedding. She had laundered them until they were pristine and white again. I smiled, feeling a deep, quiet gratitude for the people who had stood by me when I decided to stop being invisible. I hung the frame near my desk, adding a handwritten note that read, "Service is skilled work. Obedience is not part of the job." I was wrapping up the payroll files for the week when the office door swung open. Paige stepped inside, unannounced. Her clothing was plain, lacking the designer labels and tailored lines she had once worn, but her posture still held the old, entitled rigidity. She demanded I intervene to lower her monthly repayment installments or perhaps find her a position within our cooperative, acting as if I still possessed the agency to fix her life. "After everything I gave you," she said, her voice dripping with that familiar, manipulative cadence, "you owe me." I pulled the thick folder of financial documents from my drawer, sliding the summary of the times I had saved her payroll with my own funds across the desk. I did not look up from my screen as I pushed the papers toward her. "No," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "This is what I gave you. What you owe belongs to everyone else." Paige stood there for a long moment, waiting for me to break, waiting for the older sister to rescue her from the discomfort of her own reality. When I did not move, when I simply went back to checking the numbers for the Friday payroll, she finally turned around and walked out the door. I locked it behind her, experiencing a calm that would have been unimaginable just a few months before. My phone chimed with a notification from the bank, confirming that the payroll for our Common Table staff had been sent out in full, on time, just as it had been every week since we opened. Rosa looked over from her desk, checking to see if I was all right, and I nodded. Everything was handled. Everything was accurate. I turned back to the spreadsheet, mapping out the plans for the coming month, working in a space where no one was ever invisible and every person was treated with the basic dignity they had earned through their own labor. For once, everyone who had done the work was paid before anyone raised a glass. If you find yourself standing in the shoes I once wore, constantly pouring your own vitality into a vessel that refuses to hold water, you need to understand that your capacity to serve does not grant others the right to own you. You have been told that family loyalty is a one-way street paved with your own sacrifices, but that is a lie designed to keep you silent and useful. True service is a professional exchange of skills and dedication, while obedience is a cage built by those who fear your independence. When you realize that your value is being measured only by your utility to others, you are not being a good daughter, a good sister, or a good friend. You are simply being an enabler of their own decline. You deserve to build a life where your efforts are recognized with fairness, not just exploited until you are empty. It is not an act of selfishness to place boundaries around your time, your money, and your spirit. In fact, setting those lines is the most generous thing you can do, both for yourself and for the people who claim to love you. By allowing them to face the natural consequences of their own choices, you stop subsidizing their dysfunction and give them the only opportunity they will ever have to grow. If they refuse that opportunity, then you have finally stopped the cycle of enabling, which is the first step toward genuine freedom. Look at the ledger of your own life and ask yourself who is doing the work and who is reaping the harvest. Are you carrying a heavy silver tray for people who laugh at your service? Or are you building something real, where every person who contributes is treated with the dignity they have earned? It is never too late to stop holding up the structures that are meant to keep you small. You possess the agency to walk away from the table, to set down the tray, and to start writing your own contract, not just in your business life, but in every single relationship you hold. Take a moment to think about the burdens you are currently carrying that belong to someone else. What would your life look like if you stopped picking up the pieces they insist on breaking? I want you to consider this today. What is one boundary you have been afraid to set because you feared the reaction of those who benefit from your silence? I invite you to share your thoughts, because there is power in naming the invisible walls we have been conditioned to accept as normal. You are the architect of your own future, and you have the absolute right to decide who gets a seat at your table.